Heavy chains clinked against the polished oak floor, shattering the courtroom's stifling silence. Archer Dawson, a decorated combat veteran, stood accused of a brutal crime he didn't commit. In minutes, a merciless judge would seal his fate, completely unaware that their impending collision would permanently destroy a corrupt man's empire. Fluorescent lights buzzed like angry hornets in the ceiling of courtroom 302. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of morning sunlight that struggled through the high, frosted windows. Archer Dawson sat motionless at the defense table, his broad shoulders squared, his hands resting flat against his thighs. Despite the ill-fitting, government-issued gray suit that hung loosely from his disciplined frame, he carried himself with the unmistakable rigidity of a soldier. 2 tours in Kandahar with the 82nd Airborne had stripped away his capacity to panic, leaving only a cold, hyper-vigilant calm. Beside him sat Sarah Jenkins, a public defender drowning under a caseload that would break a lesser attorney. She feverishly shuffled through manila folders, a sheen of nervous sweat glistening on her forehead. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Thomas Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, the picture of relaxed confidence. Sterling was a shark in a tailored Italian suit, a man whose political ambitions were paved with high conviction rates. But the true epicenter of power in the room was the bench. Honorable Judge Richard Caldwell stared down at the proceedings with eyes like chipped flint. Caldwell was a local legend, a man notorious for his zero-tolerance policies and sentences that bordered on draconian. He was a relic of a bygone era of jurisprudence, commanding absolute authority. When Caldwell struck his gavel, careers ended and lives were locked away. Archer was facing 15 years for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and malicious destruction of property. The man who had put him there sat directly behind the prosecution's table, Bishop Coleman. Coleman was the heir to a sprawling real estate development firm, a man who wore his generational wealth like a suit of armor. He sat with his legs casually crossed, occasionally checking a diamond-encrusted Rolex, looking less like a victim of a brutal assault and more like a CEO enduring a boring board meeting. Mr. Sterling. Judge Caldwell's voice rumbled through the microphone, a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded instant silence. Is the state ready to proceed with its opening statements? We are, Your Honor, Sterling replied, buttoning his suit jacket as he rose smoothly to his feet. He walked deliberately to the center of the room. Turning his back to Archer and facing the 12 men and women of the jury, "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice dripping with practiced solemnity, "we owe our veterans an unpayable debt. They go to dangerous places so that we might sleep safely in our beds. But what happens when the war doesn't stay overseas? What happens when a man trained to destroy brings that violence back to our peaceful suburban streets?" Sterling pivoted, pointing a manicured finger directly at Archer. Archer Dawson is a ticking time bomb, a man who refused to seek help for his deep-seated psychological trauma. On the night of October 12th, Mr. Bishop Coleman, a respected community leader and businessman, was simply surveying a parcel of land near the defendant's property. Without warning, without provocation, the defendant ambushed him. Using his military-grade combat training and a heavy steel wrench, Mr. Dawson beat an unarmed man within an inch of his life and proceeded to destroy his vehicle. Archer didn't blink. He kept his eyes locked on the American flag standing motionless behind the judge's bench. Inside, however, a familiar tightness gripped his chest. It was the same suffocating injustice he had felt on the night of his arrest. Sterling paced slowly back and forth, weaving a narrative of a deranged, unhinged man who had lost his grip on reality. He painted Coleman as a saint, a visionary developer who only wanted to improve the neighborhood, tragically victimized by a dangerous outlier. "The defense will likely tell you a different story," Sterling continued, his tone turning dismissive. "They will try to play on your sympathies. They will wave Mr. Dawson's service record in your face, as if a uniform is a blank check to commit violent felonies. But the evidence, the broken bones, the shattered glass, the blood on the defendant's hands will speak the undeniable truth. You must hold him accountable." As Sterling returned to his seat to a murmur of approval from Coleman's wealthy entourage in the gallery, Sarah Jenkins stood up. She was trembling slightly, but her voice was surprisingly firm. "Members of the jury," Sarah said, stepping out from behind the heavy wooden table. "The prosecution is telling you a story of a monster, but you are not looking at a monster. You are looking at a man who was defending his home, his family, and his own life." She glanced back at Archer, offering a fleeting, tight-lipped smile of solidarity. "The state's entire case rests on the word of one man, a man of immense privilege who is accustomed to the world bending to his will. You will hear evidence that Bishop Coleman was not surveying property in the dead of night. We will show that Mr. Coleman's version of events is a fabricated shield designed to hide his own reckless, dangerous, and criminal behavior. Archer Dawson did not ambush anyone. He survived an attack. And unfortunately, when the police arrived, they listened to the man in the expensive car and ignored the black veteran standing on his own ruined front lawn." Judge Caldwell's heavy brow furrowed at the mention of race and class dynamics. He leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto Sarah. "Counselor, stick to the facts of the incident, not sociological commentary." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said, swallowing hard. "The facts will show that Archer Dawson is innocent." "Thank you." Archer watched the jury's faces. A few looked sympathetic, but most looked skeptical. The narrative of the broken, dangerous veteran was deeply ingrained, and Sterling had played that card masterfully. The mountain Archer had to climb was steep, and the man holding the ropes, Judge Caldwell, looked ready to cut them at any moment. The afternoon session began with the prosecution's star witness. Bishop Coleman walked toward the witness stand with the self-assured stride of a man walking into an exclusive country club. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down, adjusting his cuffs. Thomas Sterling approached the stand with a warm, empathetic smile. "Mr. Coleman, thank you for being here today. I know recounting this trauma cannot be easy." "It isn't, Mr. Sterling," Coleman corrected himself with a practiced, self-deprecating chuckle. "But I believe in the justice system. I believe in doing what's right. Take us back to the night of October 12th, Sterling prompted gently. Coleman leaned into the microphone, his voice modulating into a perfectly calibrated tone of victimhood. "I was driving through the Southside District. My company is looking to invest heavily in the area, to bring in grocery stores, community centers. I pulled my car over near the end of Elm Street to look at an empty lot. I had just stepped out of my vehicle when I heard someone shouting. Could you make out what they were saying?" "It was just rage," Coleman said, shaking his head sorrowfully. "He was screaming about how people like me were ruining his neighborhood. Before I could even introduce myself, he was on me. He hit me in the ribs with something metal. A wrench, I think. I fell to the ground. He kept hitting me, and then he started smashing the windshield of my car. I thought I was going to die right there on the sidewalk." Sterling let the heavy silence hang in the courtroom, ensuring the jury absorbed the full impact of the fabricated terror. "And this is the man who attacked you?" Sterling asked, pointing a dramatic finger at Archer. Coleman looked at Archer, his expression twisting into a mask of contrived fear. "Yes, that's him." Archer's jaw tightened. The memories of that night flashed behind his eyes, a stark, violent contrast to the sanitized lies echoing in the courtroom. Archer remembered the screech of tires. He remembered sitting on his porch, polishing his boots, when Coleman's luxury SUV came tearing down the residential street at 60 miles an hour, swerving wildly. The vehicle had jumped the curb, plowing through Archer's chain-link fence and stopping inches from the sandbox where Archer's 5-year-old niece had been playing just 10 minutes prior. Archer had rushed to the vehicle to check on the driver. Coleman had stumbled out, reeking of expensive scotch, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. When Archer demanded to know what he was doing, Coleman hadn't apologized. Instead, the wealthy developer had unleashed a torrent of racial slurs, furious that his car was scratched by Archer's fence. When Archer told him the police were being called, Coleman had grabbed a heavy tire iron from his trunk and swung it directly at Archer's head. Archer's muscle memory had taken over. He had blocked the strike, disarmed the drunk millionaire, and swept his legs out from under him, pinning him to the ground until the sirens wailed. But when the patrol cars arrived, Coleman had immediately started shouting that he had been mugged. The officers had looked at the pristine, albeit crashed, luxury SUV, looked at the wealthy white man in the torn designer suit, and then looked at the black man holding the tire iron. Archer was in handcuffs before he could even speak. "Your witness," Sterling said, taking his seat. Sarah Jenkins stood, carrying a legal pad. She approached the podium, her knuckles white as she gripped the wood. "Mr. Coleman, you testified that you were surveying property for community centers. At 11:45 p.m.? I work long hours," Coleman replied smoothly, unbothered. "Inspiration strikes when it strikes. And the fact that your blood alcohol level was taken at the hospital 2 hours later and found to be 12, was that part of your inspiration?" Sterling shot to his feet. "Objection. Inadmissible under pretrial rulings, Your Honor." "Sustained," Judge Caldwell barked, glaring at Sarah. "The jury will disregard the counselor's last statement. Miss Jenkins, you are treading on very thin ice. We have already litigated the admissibility of the hospital records due to chain of custody errors. But, Your Honor, it speaks directly to his state of mind. I said sustained, counselor. Move on, or sit down." Archer felt a cold stone drop in his stomach. The system was airtight, protecting its own. Coleman had hired expensive lawyers who had successfully suppressed the toxicology report on a technicality. The jury would never know Coleman was drunk. "Mr. Coleman," Sarah pressed on, pivoting her strategy. "When the police arrived, where exactly was your vehicle parked?" "On the street, near the curb." Coleman lied easily. "Are you certain it wasn't halfway through my client's front fence?" "I may have lost control of the vehicle after he started smashing my windshield and terrifying me," Coleman countered quickly. "It was a chaotic blur." Sarah gritted her teeth. Coleman was a slippery, prepared witness. Every time she tried to corner him with logic, he retreated behind the shield of subjective trauma, and Sterling was there to object to any aggressive line of questioning. However, high above the sparring lawyers, a subtle shift was occurring. Judge Caldwell was no longer looking at the witness. His hawkish eyes were fixed intently on the defense table. Specifically, he was staring at a small, battered leather notebook sitting next to Archer's folded hands. Archer had brought it with him to court every day. It was his anchor, a journal he had kept during his deployments in the Korengal Valley. The cover was stained with sweat, dirt, and something darker. Etched roughly into the worn leather was a specific emblem, a crude hand-drawn insignia of a black spade with a jagged lightning bolt cutting through the center. It was the unofficial logo of Archer's specific forward operating base, drawn by a brother-in-arms who hadn't made it back. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, his reading glasses slipping slightly down his nose. The harsh, impatient lines on his weathered face seemed to loosen, replaced by an expression of profound shock. He stared at the leather notebook, then raised his eyes to study Archer's face, truly looking at him for the first time, noting the precise angle of his posture, the specific way his hands rested, the quiet dignity masking a deep, familiar pain. "Your Honor?" Sarah's voice broke the judge's sudden trance. She had asked a question, and Sterling had objected. Both lawyers were staring at the bench, waiting for a ruling. Caldwell blinked, seemingly pulling himself back from a distant memory. He cleared his throat, but the trademark gravelly boom was noticeably absent. "What was the question?" Caldwell asked, his voice unexpectedly quiet. Sterling looked confused. "The defense asked about the specific make of the tire iron found at the scene, Your Honor. I objected on the grounds of relevance." Caldwell looked at Coleman, who was sitting smugly on the stand, radiating entitlement. Then, the judge looked back at Archer, his eyes resting once again on the worn leather journal with the black spade. "Overruled," Caldwell stated firmly, shocking the entire courtroom. "The witness will answer the question, and Mr. Sterling, sit down." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of confused murmurs. Thomas Sterling's jaw went slack, his confident posture dissolving into absolute bewilderment. He had spent the last 3 years trying cases in this very room, and not once had he seen Judge Richard Caldwell reverse course so abruptly, nor had he ever been spoken to with such icy, undisguised dismissal. Sarah Jenkins didn't hesitate. She didn't know what had just shifted the tectonic plates of the courtroom, but she wasn't about to waste the opportunity. "Mr. Coleman," Sarah said, her voice ringing with newfound authority, "I'll ask you again. The tire iron recovered at the scene, the weapon my client allegedly used to attack you. Where did it come from?" Coleman shifted uncomfortably in the oak witness chair. His tailored suit suddenly looked a little too tight around the collar. I assume he brought it with him." "You assume?" Sarah pressed, stepping closer to the jury box. "Because the crime scene technicians found fresh grease on the handle that perfectly matches the specialized lubricant used on the spare tire mount in the trunk of your luxury SUV. A trunk that the police report notes was found wide open." "Objection! Speculation!" Sterling shouted, desperate to regain control. "Overruled," Caldwell barked instantly. "The witness will explain the grease." Coleman wiped a sudden bead of sweat from his temple. I might have taken it out earlier that week to check my spare. I don't keep inventory of my tools. The man attacked me. I wasn't paying attention to where he got his weapon." Judge Caldwell leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together on the bench. His knuckles were bone white. He was staring directly at Archer, but his eyes were fixed on the weathered journal resting on the table. "Counselors." "Mr. Dawson." Caldwell's voice was dangerously low, vibrating with an emotion nobody in the room could identify. "In my chambers. Right now, we are taking a 15-minute recess." The heavy wooden door to the judge's chambers clicked shut, sealing out the noise of the gallery. The room was lined with leather-bound legal volumes and smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Caldwell didn't sit behind his massive mahogany desk. He stood by the window, his back to the room, taking several deep, shaky breaths before turning around. "Mr. Dawson," Caldwell said, ignoring the two attorneys entirely, "that notebook on your table, the one with the black spade and the jagged lightning bolt." Archer stiffened, his military bearing instantly returning. "Yes, sir." "Where did you get it?" Caldwell asked. His voice wasn't a demand, it was a plea. Sarah stepped forward protectively. "Your Honor, I don't see how my client's personal property is relevant to—" "Quiet, Miss Jenkins," Caldwell interrupted softly. He didn't look angry. He looked old, suddenly, and profoundly tired. "Please, Archer, tell me where you got that insignia." Archer hesitated, his guarded eyes studying the judge's face. Slowly, the veteran reached into his jacket pocket, withdrew the battered leather journal, and held it out. "It's not an official unit patch, Your Honor," Archer said, his voice steady, but thick with a grief that never truly faded. "It was drawn by my commanding officer in the Korengal Valley. We were pinned down in a firefight that lasted 3 days. He drew this on the cover of his notebook to keep our morale up, said we were the storm that the enemy couldn't weather." Caldwell closed his eyes. A single, ragged exhale escaped his lips. "First Lieutenant David Caldwell." Archer's breath hitched. For the first time since the trial began, his impenetrable calm cracked. "Yes, sir, Lieutenant Caldwell." Sterling looked wildly between the judge and the defendant, completely lost. "Your Honor, I don't understand." "David was my son," Caldwell whispered, opening his eyes. They were bright with unshed tears. He stepped closer to Archer, looking at the man with a painful intensity. "David died in the Korengal. An IED hit his transport," the military report said. The report said one of his men pulled him from the burning wreckage, stayed with him, and held the perimeter single-handedly until medevac arrived. But David didn't make it to the hospital. "He didn't die alone, sir," Archer said softly, his voice barely a rasp. "He was a good man, the best officer I ever served under. He gave me this journal the night before the convoy. I've carried it every day since." The silence in the chambers was absolute, heavy, and sacred. Thomas Sterling realized the horrific implications of the moment. The ruthless, zero-tolerance judge was staring at the man who had comforted his dying son. "Your Honor," Sterling stammered, his political instincts overriding his humanity. "Given this revelation, you must recuse yourself. This is a massive conflict of interest. We need a mistrial." Caldwell turned his head slowly, locking eyes with the prosecutor. The grief in the judge's face instantly hardened into a mask of terrifying, righteous fury. "I will do no such thing, Mr. Sterling," Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "If I recuse myself, this case goes back into the lottery. It gets delayed, and dragging this man's life through the mud for another year. No, I swore an oath to oversee the blind administration of justice. And for the past 3 days I have sat on that bench and watched you deliberately suppress evidence, hide behind procedural technicalities, and present a narrative that reeks of perjury." "Your Honor, I resent that," Sterling began. "You will shut your mouth, Counselor," Caldwell commanded, stepping into Sterling's personal space. "You wanted my strict adherence to the law? You're about to get it. We are going back into that courtroom. And if I find even a microscopic shred of evidence that your star witness has lied under oath, or that your office buried exculpatory evidence to secure a conviction, I will not just dismiss this case with prejudice. I will personally petition the State Bar to strip your license, and I will refer you for criminal prosecution. Do we understand each other?" Sterling swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good," Caldwell snapped, straightening his robes. He looked back at Archer, offering a fractional, solemn nod. "Let's go find the truth." When courtroom 302 reconvened, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The jury, sensing the sudden shift in the room's gravity, sat up straighter. Bishop Coleman returned to the witness stand, adjusting his silk tie, completely unaware that the protective shield of the judicial system had just been stripped away from him. Sarah Jenkins approached the podium. During the brief recess, she had received a frantic text message from her paralegal. Karma, it seemed, had a sense of timing. "Mr. Coleman," Sarah began, her confidence now radiating through the room. "You testified that my client attacked your vehicle, correct?" "Yes," Coleman sighed, adopting his weary victim persona. "He smashed the windshield and the front grille with the tire iron. And your vehicle is a 2024 heavily modified Mercedes-Benz G-Class, correct?" "It is." Sarah turned to the judge. "Your Honor, during the recess, my office received a faxed document from the prosecution's own evidence discovery cache. It is a document that the prosecution possessed but conveniently excluded from their primary exhibit list, burying it in an appendix of over 2,000 pages. Sterling jumped up. "Objection! The defense is attempting to introduce unvetted data to ambush the witness." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling." Judge Caldwell slammed his gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "The prosecution is reminded of their Brady obligations to disclose exculpatory evidence. If you buried something, Miss Jenkins is going to dig it up." "Overruled. Proceed, Counselor." "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah said, handing a copy of a highly technical printout to the bailiff, who passed it to Coleman. "Mr. Coleman, are you familiar with an event data recorder? An EDR?" Coleman stared at the paper, his smug expression faltering. "A what?" "A black box, Mr. Coleman. Just like on an airplane. Your luxury SUV is equipped with one. It records exactly what the car is doing in the moments leading up to an airbag deployment. According to this data report, pulled by the police mechanics but ignored by the prosecution, your vehicle was traveling at 68 miles per hour at 11:42 p.m. Sarah paused, letting the number sink into the jury's minds. 68 miles per hour on Elm Street. "A residential neighborhood with a posted speed limit of 25, Sarah continued, her voice rising in volume. "Furthermore, the EDR shows that your brakes were not applied until precisely 0.8 seconds before a massive, localized impact to the front grille, an impact that deployed the airbags." Coleman gripped the edges of the witness stand. I was trying to get away from him. He was in the street. "That is a physical impossibility, Mr. Coleman." Sarah fired back, because if a heavy SUV traveling at 68 miles per hour struck a human being, my client wouldn't be sitting at that defense table. He would be dead. The data shows the impact was with a stationary, anchored object, like a steel-reinforced chain-link fence, the exact fence bordering my client's front yard. The gallery began to mutter. The jury was leaning forward, their eyes darting between the irrefutable data and the unraveling millionaire. "You didn't pull over to survey property, did you?" Sarah demanded. "You were heavily intoxicated. You lost control of your vehicle, jumped the curb, and crashed into Archer Dawson's yard, narrowly missing the area where his young niece plays. And when he came out to check on you, you realized you were facing a massive DUI and a reckless endangerment charge." "That's a lie," Coleman shouted, his face flushing crimson. His polished civility was cracking, revealing the arrogant, petulant man underneath. "So you grabbed the tire iron from your own trunk." Sarah pushed harder, her voice relentless. "You attacked him to silence him. But you didn't expect him to fight back. You didn't expect a combat veteran to easily disarm you. So when the police arrived, you played the only card you had. You played the victim. You used your wealth, your suit, and your skin color to frame an innocent man for your own violent, drunken crimes." "Objection! Badgering!" Sterling yelled, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Overruled!" Caldwell thundered, leaning so far over the bench he looked ready to leap over it. "The witness will answer the accusation." "I don't have to listen to this," Coleman erupted, pointing a shaking finger at Archer. "Look at him. He's a violent thug. He broke my arm. He humiliated me. I own half the real estate in this city, and you're going to take the word of a broken, washed-up soldier over mine?" The courtroom fell into a dead, stunned silence. Coleman had just said the quiet part out loud. He had ripped the mask off his own prejudice, exposing his entire fabricated narrative for what it was, an exercise in ego and entitlement. Archer sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on Coleman, his face a monument of quiet dignity against the backdrop of the developer's screaming entitlement. Judge Caldwell slowly picked up his gavel. The silence in the room was heavier than the chains Archer had walked in with. "Mr. Coleman," Caldwell's voice was dangerously calm, a terrifying contrast to the witness's outburst. "You have just confessed to perjury in my courtroom. You have admitted to weaponizing the justice system to cover up a felony DUI and an aggravated assault against an innocent man." Caldwell looked at the jury, who were staring at Coleman with outright disgust, then turned his eyes to the prosecution table. "Mr. Sterling," Caldwell continued, "the state's case is a complete fabrication built on a foundation of perjury and buried evidence. I am dismissing all charges against Archer Dawson with prejudice. He is a free man." Before the gallery could even react, Caldwell pointed his gavel directly at Coleman, his eyes blazing with the fierce, protective justice of a father and a judge. "Bailiff," Caldwell ordered, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Take Mr. Bishop Coleman into custody. He is under arrest for perjury, filing a false police report, and aggravated assault. Let's see how well your wealth protects you in a holding cell." The sharp, metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoing through courtroom 302 was the sweetest sound Archer Dawson had ever heard. Two heavily armed bailiffs flanked the witness stand. Bishop Coleman, whose face had drained of all its arrogant color, stared in absolute paralyzing disbelief as his wrists were wrenched behind his back. This was a man who had never faced a consequence in his 35 years of life, a man whose family name was emblazoned on hospital wings and downtown skyscrapers. "Get your hands off me!" Coleman shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Do you know who I am? My father plays golf with the governor. I'll have your badges." "You have the right to remain silent, Mr. Coleman," the older bailiff stated with profound satisfaction, ignoring the billionaire's thrashing. "I highly suggest you start exercising it." As Coleman was physically dragged from the courtroom, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing awkwardly against the polished oak floor, the gallery erupted into a frenzy. Reporters who had shown up expecting a routine, open and shut conviction of a troubled veteran were now furiously typing on their phones, recognizing the explosive nature of the story unfolding before them. At the prosecution table, Thomas Sterling sat frozen, his pristine career shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Judge Caldwell directed his piercing gaze toward the disgraced prosecutor. "Mr. Sterling, you are officially under investigation by this court. Your office's deliberate mishandling of the event data recorder evidence and your willful blindness to the obvious perjury of your star witness is a stain on the legal profession. Hand over your files to Miss Jenkins immediately. Then get out of my sight." Sterling didn't argue. He didn't offer a defense. He simply packed his monogrammed leather briefcase with shaking hands and practically sprinted from the room, leaving a legacy of corruption behind him. Sarah Jenkins let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 months. She turned to Archer, her eyes shining with tears of profound relief. "We did it," she whispered, her professional facade finally giving way to sheer emotion. "You're free, Archer." "No, Sarah," Archer replied, his deep voice rumbling with quiet gratitude as he extended a large, calloused hand to his attorney. "You did it. You didn't stop digging." The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of catastrophic proportions for the Coleman family empire. Hard karma does not arrive quietly. It hits like a freight train. By 6 o'clock that evening, the courtroom footage had been leaked to local investigative journalist Cynthia Mayweather, who broadcasted the unedited video on the evening news. The public reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The city, tired of the blatant corruption and untouchable elite, rallied behind the decorated black veteran who had been pushed to the absolute brink. The fallout for Coleman Real Estate Holdings was apocalyptic. Investors, desperate to distance themselves from the toxic PR nightmare of a racist, violent, perjury-committing heir, pulled their funding overnight. Within 48 hours, the board of directors convened an emergency meeting. In a desperate bid to save the company's plummeting stock, they not only formally ousted Bishop Coleman from all executive roles, but completely severed his trust fund access to pay for the impending barrage of civil lawsuits. Bishop Coleman, denied bail by a furious appellate judge who deemed his immense wealth a severe flight risk, spent his first week of incarceration in the sprawling, unforgiving environment of the county jail's general population. Stripped of his tailored suits and his sycophantic entourage, he was suddenly just another inmate in an orange jumpsuit, terrified and entirely alone, facing a mandatory minimum of 7 years for aggravated perjury and assault. The system he had so confidently weaponized against Archer had swallowed him whole. 6 weeks after the gavel fell, the crisp autumn air had finally begun to settle over the city. Archer Dawson stood in his front yard, the afternoon sun warming the back of his neck. The mangled chain-link fence that Coleman had destroyed was gone, replaced by a sturdy, beautifully crafted cedarwood barrier that Archer had built himself. Behind it, the joyful, high-pitched laughter of his niece echoed from the sandbox, a sound that brought a rare, genuine smile to his weathered face. A sleek, unmarked Blacktown car pulled slowly to the curb, idling quietly. Archer wiped the sawdust from his hands and walked to the gate. The rear door opened, and Richard Caldwell stepped out. He wasn't wearing his imposing black judicial robes today. Instead, he wore a simple navy sweater and slacks, looking less like a force of legal vengeance and more like a weary, aging father seeking peace. "That's a fine-looking fence, Archer," Caldwell said, his voice softer, stripped of its courtroom gravel. "Keeps the trouble out, Your Honor," Archer replied respectfully, opening the gate. "Richard, please," the older man insisted, extending his hand. Archer took it, their grip firm and mutually understanding. "I wanted to come by," Richard began, looking out over the quiet suburban street. "I wanted to see the man who stayed with my boy. The military. They tell you your son died a hero, but they speak in sterile reports and redacted files. They don't give you the truth of his final moments." Archer nodded slowly, gesturing toward a pair of lawn chairs on his porch. The two men sat down, the silence between them comfortable, bridging the massive gaps in their backgrounds, races, and stations in life. Lieutenant Caldwell. David, Archer started, his voice steady. He was not afraid, Richard. When the convoy was hit, the chaos was absolute. But your son, he was entirely focused on his men. When the second blast hit his transport, he was already pulling our gunner to safety. Richard closed his eyes, his breathing shaky, and you stayed with him. I pulled him behind the wreckage. Archer confirmed softly. He knew he wasn't going to make it, but he didn't panic. He handed me that journal with the spade on it. He told me to tell his men to keep fighting, to weather the storm. Archer paused, looking directly into the grieving father's eyes. He talked about you. He said he hoped he made the judge proud. A single tear escaped Richard Caldwell's eye, tracking down his deeply lined cheek. For years, he had wielded his gavel like a weapon, pouring his unresolved grief and anger into a rigid, unforgiving interpretation of the law. He had built a fortress of bitterness. But sitting on this porch, listening to the man who had held his son as he bled out in the dust of the Korengal Valley, the fortress finally crumbled. You did make him proud, Archer, Richard whispered, wiping his face. And you saved my life in that courtroom. You reminded me of what justice is actually supposed to mean. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He handed it to Archer. Archer opened it carefully. Inside, resting on dark silk, was a gleaming, pristine, silver star medal. The military sent that to me a year after he died, Richard explained, his voice thick with emotion. I couldn't bear to look at it. It just felt like a piece of metal replacing my son, but I realize now David wouldn't want it sitting in a dark drawer. He would want it with the man who fought beside him. Archer stared at the medal, profoundly moved. I can't take this, Richard. It belongs to his family. You are his family, Archer, Richard said firmly, placing his hand over Archer's. The men who bleed together are bound by something stronger than blood. Keep it. Let it remind you that you are not broken, and you are never alone. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the rebuilt yard. Two men from entirely different worlds sat together in the fading light, bound by tragedy, forged in the fires of an unforgiving justice system, and finally at peace. Archer Dawson had fought a war overseas and came home to fight a war in his own front yard. But as he looked at the silver star, and then at the sturdy new fence protecting his family, he knew the fighting was finally over. The storm had passed. Did this story of justice and karma hit home for you? Sometimes the truth takes time, but it always comes to light. If you were moved by Archer's unwavering bravery and the judge's shocking discovery, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping, real-life stories of ultimate karma and courtroom drama. Thank you so much for watching.